Good morning and welcome to our edition of What's News in Healthcare Social Media. I'm Kathy Brown of Brown Knows Social Media, and we're going to be talking today about the hot topics in social media in healthcare. My guest today is Rick Wyan. And Rick Wyan is someone that I've been trying to connect with for some time, and I finally had the opportunity to bring him onto the show. He is the first director of social media for McDonald's. And he also has a background in pharmaceutical marketing and a lot of other things that I didn't know about until I talked with him. So I'm really excited to introduce him today. Rick, would you like?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Rick, and as Kathy mentioned, I was first ever director of social media for McDonald's. About a month ago, I struck out and am now consulting on my own with brands. But in my background, I've worked in social for a while, actually, before we called it even social. I found an old memo talking about Web 2.0 and how that was going to revolutionize things. But over the time, I've worked with B2B pharma and consumer brands. On the pharma side, I've worked with J&J. I helped launch the Concerta brand a couple of years ago. Also worked with Shire, with Boehringer Ingelheim, and clients like that.
So you have a well-rounded background.
Yeah, lots of
very well equipped to talk about what we're going to talk about today then.
Yes.
Great. Well, before the cameras were rolling, you were telling a little bit about how you managed to convince a large corporation like McDonald's to create a position like that. Would you like to share just a little bit of that with our viewing of Interesting?
Sure. So the way that McDonald's got into social was actually fairly common with what I've seen in a lot of brands, where it started off as one little thing. So in fall of 2006, there was a charitable campaign that was going on, and we did blogger outreach as part of that campaign. Now, at the time, nowadays doing blogger outreach seems kind of like it's a given, but then it was a very nerve-wracking. It's like, oh my, well, we don't control these people, and what if they say something bad, and all that nervousness that corporations go through. But the blogger campaign went well, and then from there it became, okay, well, let's do a little bit more, let's do a little bit more, let's do a little bit more, up to going from social being one project that was a bolt-on to a larger campaign into social becoming its own practice area within the business. But that trajectory from one campaign into a fully formed business unit was about 4 years. So it was a slow progression, but they got there.
Now, do you have much of a background in actual analytics, or is that something that another area of your department would have taken care of?
So analytics has always been a core to what I do, but also working with partners on our analytics and insights team to make us stronger and make us smarter. Something that Tom and I were talking about before the show started was the need for analytics to be tied to the actual business and to business goals. And what I mean by that is it's really important. There's all kinds of great analytics out there in social, but a lot of times they measure social media as social performance itself. They don't necessarily tie to the business. And so here's an example of that from McDonald's. They get 3 million tweets a month. It's huge. There's a huge volume of conversation. And if we just said, hey, we got 3 million tweets this month and we got 3.1 million next month, that's not really actionable for other areas of the business. But if we break that down and say, okay, within those tweets, we got X number of tweets about the drive-thru being too slow, or this number of tweets about a restaurant manager being really nice to people. And so taking social media and then putting it through a filter of what are the key performance indicators overall for the business and trying to make those two ties, I think it's something that a lot of organizations will be evolving to in the future.
I think that's a really good point, because I know one of the frustrating things I frequently hear from people when they're a lot of the healthcare organizations, they start on Facebook, not because that's the place they should be, but that's where their employees are comfortable, and so they think, well, if we already know Facebook, we'll go to Facebook because that's where everybody is. And then when they contact a company to tell them whether they're doing well or not doing well or help them out, the first thing they want to do is count the likes.
Yeah.
Well, so what? You get a like. What do you do with a like?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you made a quick reference to Tom, so I would like to go ahead and go to the first article that we're going to talk about and bring Tom into the mix. And the first article we're going to talk about was published by Simpler, and it is Ebola on Social Media Shows Some Revealing Insights. And I have with me today to join us for this article, Tom Lee, co-founder of Simpler. So Tom, would you like to say hello?
Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here, and good to see you, Kathy and Rick.
Wonderful to see you. And I'm so glad that you can come and speak to this article that you yourself wrote, right?
That's correct.
So this article talks about things that you have been able to learn through gathering the data, the tweets out there regarding the Ebola conversation, and that has really taken off recently. So would you like to just run with us and kind of give a synopsis of what some of the highlights of this article include?
Sure, absolutely. Well, for starters, we recognize that on July the 28th, which is when Ebola first really started to become one of the lead stories in the United States anyway, that we weren't tracking that in our healthcare hashtag project. Nobody had ever submitted the Ebola hashtag to us. It had seemed up until that time that it had been somewhat irrelevant, and suddenly it had this relevancy. So we made sure that we got the Ebola hashtag along with a few other hashtags related to it into our system and started monitoring it at that time. And over the next couple months or so, we amassed almost 2 million tweets on the subject. And we started to look into that. One of the first things that jumped out at me anyway was the fact that we could see how the conversation had kind of waned over time. And yet at the same time, we knew the reality was that the crisis was spreading. It was spreading to other countries. The death toll was growing, and it was becoming a worse situation. But the social conversation was just kind of disappearing slowly over time. And it didn't seem like it was mimicking reality at all. Another thing that we noticed was that when there were news stories, and of course yesterday there was certainly a news story, but whenever there was a news story, we would see a little bit of a spike. And the largest spike in that whole time was when the two patients came back from the workers, the physician and the other aid worker, came back to the U.S. and went to the hospital in Atlanta where they were being treated for Ebola. And that had a huge spike, about 90,000 tweets on a single day on the various Ebola hashtags, all for the most part really kind of reacting to that Ebola on U.S. soil type of mentality. And from that time, it slid off up until yesterday. And yesterday, we just saw some just in terms of overall activity on Twitter related to Ebola, it just went off the charts.
One of the things that I noticed about this article that I hadn't really thought about, and it makes sense, is that the trending locations geographically don't match necessarily where Ebola is most prevalent, but more about where people are talking about it. Because the places where Ebola up until this point have existed have not been places where a lot of people are online talking about it, it doesn't represent geographically the outbreak and the disease itself, the trending of the disease itself.
That's true. That's true. And I think that everybody would probably recognize that the United States has a larger presence on Twitter in general. So whenever we look at global activity on Twitter, that's largely driven by what's happening in the U.S. But after that, if we start to take a look at the specific countries that where the crisis is taking place, these are among some of the poorer nations in Africa. And the luxury even of having a cell phone and the time to be on social media is somewhat limited in much of those populations. We were surprised, however, that after the United States, it was Nigeria that was the most active nation, just in terms of volume of tweets. So that one was not one that we necessarily would have expected to see.
And why do you think that was?
That's a conversation that I would like to kind of dive into and take a closer look as to why that was and what all was being said there. I've not done that yet, but some of the things that I've heard is that there was a lot of activity by government and news agencies there in trying to educate the public via social media, and so they were almost maybe nurturing some of that activity. Another thing that we actually just took a look at recently for an ABC News report, they asked us if we could kind of verify some things about a story that ran yesterday on their website. And that was a hoax that took place, largely limited to Nigeria, It was circulated on social media, namely on Twitter, and I think it was in early August. And they were suggesting that you should bathe in salt water and then drink the salt water in order to prevent contracting Ebola. And there were actually some people that died from doing that, probably had hypertension to begin with or something. But you know, that suddenly ran rampant just overnight on one day. We could just see the spike in activity from nothing to hundreds of tweets regarding that the following day. And there were a number of authoritative Twitter accounts, be they government news or other medical organizations, that were quickly trying to squash that on social media. So Nigeria has been different in terms of looking at the countries that are directly affected by the crisis and what their activity has been on social.
Hmm.
Well, and we actually saw some.
Go ahead, Rick. I was going to say, go ahead and jump in here.
Yeah. So no, I was going to say that we've actually seen some mirrors of that when I was at McDonald's. It was actually fairly common when there would be something that happened at a McDonald's restaurant or some story in the news overseas that all of a sudden would become a huge issue here. In fact, there was one where something happened in Europe, and then people thought that it was going to happen here at McDonald's, and it caused a big rush. Also, McDonald's is a brand that it has experienced its fair share of challenges with hoaxes like that as well. And one thing that's always interesting, and a piece of advice that I would give it to anyone who's working in a situation where you've got to deal with a hoax or you've got to deal in a crisis management mode, is that when it comes to rumors, they have a funny way of they'll come out of nowhere, they'll spike up like that saltwater story, and then oftentimes they'll go away just as quickly, but then they'll come back again. There's a lot of issues that I've dealt with at McDonald's that they're almost like comets. It's this big rumor comes up, it's a huge deal, there's maybe a news article about it, and then after 3 days it's kind of forgotten, and then 6 months later it's, oh, here it comes again. Right. And so you know, if you're in a position where you have to deal with that, it's a really good idea to analyze the spikes and what happened when it was trending up, what happened when it was trending down, and use that to inform and plan for if and when it comes back.
Excellent point. Yeah, definitely. You know, yesterday with the announcement of there being the first case of Ebola diagnosed on U.S. soil, that happened on the West Coast about 1:30 in the afternoon or thereabouts. At least that's when I first heard the story, and we immediately started looking at that. And I wasn't sure if I was seeing the stats correctly, because the volume, just the sheer volume, without really looking at yet, but the sheer volume of tweets that started to take place was on the neighborhood of about 3,000 per minute. And what we had been seeing, I just want to quickly look over here, probably globally about between 70 and 100,000 tweets per day. Again, this is just a quantitative figure here, but per day globally, talking about Ebola. Yesterday, that almost reached 1 million, and most of that happened within maybe about a 4 to 6 hour period, mid-afternoon or so. And again, this was a reaction to a news story, and suddenly there was this explosion of activity. I think it's worthwhile taking a look at what was being said, and how much of it was just repeating, sharing a story, or is there panic in there? Is there misinformation starting to be shared? What can we do to keep that under control? I'm sure the CDC is quite interested in keeping a nation calm right now and reassured. Social media of spreading rumors. Good information can be spread as quickly as bad information, and looking at what's happening there, I think, is an important aspect when we see this type of spike. How to best manage it.
So, well, when we look at what you've learned with this, what is the takeaway for healthcare marketers? Because as you're talking about the fact that media drives a lot of the trending and the exposure that we get with good information and the amount of bad information that ends up spreading. And I'm going back to that other thing I saw, the prayer touchdown. I forget his name because I'm not a sports fan, but he was penalized for taking a knee because they called it celebration or celebrating or illegal celebration. And every article out there that I could find on sports somehow managed to embed some mention of that in it. And when I tried to go back, because I remembered that there were people who were not Muslim who had been penalized as well, and I tried to search on it, even those stories from 2 and 3 and 4 years ago came up with the headlines of that person's name and team as if they had decided to really take advantage of that moment in media and attach it to anything they could. So is that a good thing to do?
Trying to capitalize on a story like that, I don't know. When I look at it I just look at things through a healthcare eyes. That's where all of my time has been spent in my career. And I think one thing we can learn from other instances that happen within healthcare, when I look at what happened yesterday with this surge in activity on social media, for example, and everybody talking about Ebola, most of that talking about Ebola on U.S. soil, I think that authorities should have been prepared for that. And they could have learned from this over time by looking at what does the social network look like if we want to be able to get our message out quickly across this social network. How do we need to position ourselves? Do we understand where the hubs are that can direct information to the various corners of that network out there? So I would hope that they would have been looking at this strategically in advance and position themselves on social media so that they can control that conversation in a way that proper information, good information is getting put out there. Rumor is put to them or quickly rebutted, and settle a nation down and to not let things go rampant like that. So we can learn from these different stories and apply them to the next story that comes up. But it does take some preparation.
Yeah, and the next story really is already evolving, and that is the flu-like symptoms that are resulting in paralysis. And I don't want to get too much into this because we could talk about this the whole show, yeah. But I wonder if you're going to be tracking anything on that, and if so, we need to have a follow-up discussion about that because it would be interesting to see what we can learn from that. And I'm sure that that's something that local people in every hospital area, every practice area are concerned with. I know I saw the news, and that's the information that I would be out there looking for to find out if my niece or my nephew's symptoms could possibly be, this type of thing. So, well, we're going to have to move on to the next article, and I'm really sorry that we can't continue this because it's a very interesting discussion. But we have the next article, and the next article is by HubSpot, and it's nice to dominate the most popular methods of content discovery. And I don't want to pick this whole thing apart, but I wanted to just touch on it very briefly because I thought it was worth a visit here, because it talks about 3 particular types of search: the navigational search, the informational search, and the transactional search. And it talks about having being able to separate each of those types of searches to understand the inbound traffic that's going to come and what to expect from that inbound traffic. Rick, is that something that is that common sense, or is that kind of a unique thing that this article is talking about?
So, I mean, to me, it was mostly common sense, but I think it's one of those areas where you read it and you're like, oh yeah, I totally know that, but it's some of those basic fundamentals that you need to make sure that you're thinking about, especially in terms of if you're running a campaign or you're launching a new product, looking at those different types of search behaviors and putting that through, if you've got SEO or SEM as part of your campaign mix, thinking through, okay, well, are people going to look for this product by its name itself, by the benefit it provides, or by the company name, and then using that to ask them the questions that the article posed.
Yeah, and Tom, feel free to jump in this conversation too. I don't want you to think that you can't continue with the conversation because your article is over. But what I wanted to bring out of this article was they talk about navigational search, meaning somebody knows you're out there and they're trying to find you, and they're doing their best to either put in a part of your name or something that they associate with you and find you, as opposed to someone who's looking for information that you might be able to provide. And the fact that we have Google's new Hummingbird analytics that we have, the semantic search and everything, this article kind of touches on the fact that if you're going for, if you're trying to be found by people who know you by the navigational search is what they refer to it as, then you really need to have your brand well established. Your name, you need to have variations of your names and your location and all the things that would associate your site and your information with your brand, as opposed to the informational search where you actually have to establish authority and use some of the keywords and do a little different dance than you would with your navigational search. So I don't know that we need to talk a whole lot about that. I just thought that it was interesting that they brought that up, and I don't think people always think about that. Okay, I'm going to move on to another article because I think this is a really interesting one, and especially it's in your sweet spot, Rick. So The Hill had an article that talked, it's called Pharmaceuticals, I don't even know that word. Is that awful? Decry? Decry? I've never heard that term. And, the FDA came out with some guidelines, and they asked for input on those guidelines. The cutoff for that was has passed now. We talked about it about a month and a half ago with David Harlow. And at the time, I thought it made sense. We were kind of excited about it, that they had some guidelines to go by so they would know what was expected and what wasn't expected. A lot of it had to do with the short messages in social media to not misguide people, that if you're going to say the good, you have to say the bad. And so that was probably going to weed them out of using things like Twitter, because by the time you list all the side effects, you haven't really said anything about the product, but it meant that they would have to go to different means and really communicate their message, and that they're now not necessarily going to have to follow those rules when there's misinformation that they want to address. They can just address the misinformation. However, this article really brought to light something new I didn't realize, and that is that the FDA was implying that when misinformation is out there, that those pharmaceutical companies will be responsible for addressing it, whether or not it came from them. Did you read any on this, and are you able to speak to this? Because that really doesn't seem fair to me either.
Yeah, this is an interesting one. And just a quick bit of background on the FDA piece. I always have to, it's a little nostalgic in a weird way when I read about FDA guidance in social media, because when I was working on some pharma clients, and there was no guidance. You know, the FDA guidelines were written before fax machines were even invented. And I actually had the opportunity to participate in some of the testimony back in 2009 when the FDA had open testimony from pharma brands and agencies asking for guidance on how to set up guidelines in the first place. So, you know, with all due respect to the FDA, it seems like they're just not getting to the right place and thinking all you know, all the implications through, because at the end of the day, the liability of what you can and can't do in social is going to be interpreted by the legal teams at pharma companies. And what's going to happen then is, depending upon the legal team you're working with, you're going to have some who are going to use this as yet another excuse to not do anything, and you'll have some to say, hey, let's go and because they haven't told us, we can really push the boundaries here. I've got a friend who is a lawyer at a pharma company, and he's very progressive and wants to push all the boundaries. I have another at a client who she will look for 20 reasons to not do everything. And so, unfortunately, these guidelines don't really help in either of those cases. We're still kind of left to our own devices as marketers within the healthcare space. But at the same time, I think that what this does do is open up the opportunity to have a conversation of how do we do, what as an organization, what is our stance on fair balance, and what is a reasonable attempt to have fair balance? Are there other things that we can experiment with in terms of how we communicate via Twitter, via Facebook, and use those things together to make sure that we're that we're communicating all of the things that we need to do? What is our process for tracking adverse events? Do we have a service that will do that for us so we can work on the actual marketing? So again, unfortunately, there's no new news here, but it also is an opportunity to continue the dialogue.
Well, I wonder if we have any opportunity as a healthcare community to facilitate some of this dialogue I know that FDA would probably, their head would explode, the people there, if they had to have an online conversation, but it does seem like if there was a way to do that safely, that having some form of communication and feedback would put everybody on the same page, because it seems like we're all here trying to figure out what's going on. And I have to tell you, I reached out to the people that wrote the articles on the FDA site to see if there was any way to have a conversation and a discussion in a safe manner. And when I went out there to find out how to connect with those people, all of the names I came across had no social profile anywhere, which tells me they have no experience in social media. So what are these people doing to write guidelines if they don't even have the experience to know what they're writing guidelines about? Not even LinkedIn, nothing.
Yeah, it's unfortunate.
Yeah.
But I'm also hopeful too that there, as social evolves, that there might be some technology pieces that could help facilitate this too. Like one thing that comes to mind, I don't know if you've ever seen Twitter cards. So and for anyone who doesn't know, a Twitter card is essentially, the way that Twitter's evolving, if you think of the space where a tweet exists, it's 140 characters, but as much as anything else, it's a canvas that's like about this big. And so with some of the new technologies that Twitter's rolling out, you can do things within that little square space that are more than just 140 text characters. You can create graphics and you can create expandable cards and things like that. And so that might be a way that you can cram in more than 140 characters to get to whatever sort of disclaimers and things might need to be embedded with a type of communication.
And that's a good point. We talked about that a few weeks ago when the topic was social media crisis and how to manage a crisis. And we talked about using those cards to specifically address a topic in a timely fashion, where you can put a lot of information out there and really address something quickly. So that's a good point. Well, let's move on to the next one. The next one was put out by The Guardian, and it says Hootsuite reveals paid social media marketing and e-commerce plans. So Hootsuite wants to do what all the other social sites have been doing and sell paid ads. What do you think about that, both of you? Tom, Rick?
Gosh. I personally tend to pass over ads when I'm looking at that type. There's so much to look at. There's so much competing for my eyes in the first place. I tend to know what I'm looking for, at least when my eyes are scanning through all that, and I'm not typically looking for an ad. So that's my own personal feeling on it anyway.
Rick, if you still worked for McDonald's, how would you use this in an effective way? Can I ask?
So, it's not surprising, this move. A lot of the platforms out there, so Hootsuite, Sprinkler, Spreadfast, there's a dozen of them out there, are building some sort of ad buying type of system within their platform. So it's a way to expand their products and make it more valuable for their customers, who are folks like myself. There's also some additional revenue that they can get out of it. So like you, Tom, I'm not out there looking for ads. I typically gloss over them as well. I mean, that's why ad effectiveness is in the single digits. 10%, and you're a rock star. But the advantage to something like this is that it will, if they're taking the social data and using that to better target ads, then hopefully the ads that they're serving up will be more relevant to people. So it gets to that notion of being able to serve up ads that people are of things that people are interested in, and so it's more efficient for the advertiser, and it should be a better experience for the user. On the downside, though, if I happen to tweet randomly, sarcastically about something I don't like, and then all of a sudden with ads about that thing, then that's a bad experience for me. It's a waste of money for the advertiser, and I think that and this isn't a Hootsuite problem, I think this is kind of an industry problem. I'd especially be wary of a lot of the folks who are community managers came up through the marketing and more through the communications ranks. And ad buying it's a very specific and unique skill set. And to ask people who are more PR folks to all of a sudden do ad buying, there could be some disconnects there.
Mm-hmm.
Very good points.
Definitely. All right, well, let's move on. The next article is, this one I kind of put out there to be funny because I'm always telling people I'm going to keep an eye on all these articles that say that Google's dying now. And IOL SciTech came out with one, and the title of it is The Death of Google+. So this is deeper than anything, but I did want to talk about it very briefly because what they basically said is now that Google has separated Gmail from Google+, and you no longer have to join Google+ to join Hangouts and some of the other features, that now it's a sign that even Google is admitting that Google+ is a failure. I really think that this is just the next step in letting people be a part of a very powerful tool without having to be a part of all of the social interaction that happens at the same time. I don't think that's a sign of the death of Google. What are your thoughts?
I think the space is evolving incredibly rapidly. All these different platforms and social media. I mean, we've heard the death of Twitter how many times in the past as well, or the death of Facebook. And sometimes there is the death. And we look at a MySpace that was all the rage. Just I can count a few years ago on my fingers, and it took such a nosedive overnight almost. It surprised a lot of people. So I think it's a constantly evolving space, and products like this, they'll mature, they'll evolve over time, and some will make it and some won't.
Yep.
Yeah, well, I would say as a former reporter, and don't want to sound jaded, I think that if you're a blogger or you're a reporter and you want to get some traffic for your site, to declare the death of anything is a really cheap way and easy way to do it.
Yes.
So, you know, is Google Plus dead? No. Is it evolving? Yes. I think, Tom, you're absolutely right. And even if Google were to pull the plug on it tomorrow and say, okay, you know what, it's not working, we're going to close it down. Some of the advancements that Google Plus has brought to the table have been really significant. Now, admittedly, of the social networks I'm active in, Google Plus is probably the bottom of that list. But it's still an interesting and different way that I find to connect with folks. And again, a lot of the pieces and parts of things have helped advance the social media practice in terms of thinking through things differently and getting people getting folks to connect different. And as long as Google Plus is connected to search itself and as a way to up your search rankings. Whether or not you get 5 followers or 5 million followers, it's going to be a smart idea to continue to include that in any social strategy.
Well, and I know especially in healthcare, Google Plus is really growing as a social network of choice for healthcare professionals who want to connect with peers and with patients, because the community aspect provides for a way to really keep a conversation-specific topic, and it houses all that information in one place, whether it's a picture, an infographic, a video, a discussion, or a simple post. It's all contained there in a very nice fashion. So I think that Google has really done something wonderful with Google Plus, and I can't imagine that there would be anything in the near future to challenge it. However, there is one new social platform. Rick mentioned it, and I thought it was worth mentioning. You want to do a quick synopsis of Ello?
Yeah, Ello is apparently the hot new social network that everybody needs to join. I've got a ton of friends in there, none of which have seemed to see fit to send me an invite yet, so I don't know sorry guys if I offended anyone. But so Ello's branding at this point seems to be that it is an anti-ad social network. So it says no ads, will never be ads. It's a stripped-down functionality. I don't know. It looks mildly interesting. Again, I haven't signed up yet, but when I do get an invite, I'm not sure I'm going to rush out to it, because I imagine the 30 or 40 folks that I know on there will be the 30, 40 folks that I'm already connected to on Google Plus and Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Pinterest and LinkedIn. So to see all those same status updates in a 7th social network, I'm not sure that that's going to be really huge. But then again, I'd like to tinker. I'll play with something new, see what it's at. But just like, hey, the death of this, it's like, ooh, here's the hot new item. So might be interesting, but I'm not sold yet.
Well, Tom, if the simpler theory works, then according to this, with all of the media attention it's gotten, at least temporarily, that should bring some attention to it, that there will be a temporary trending of people joining the social site. You agree?
I would probably suspect so, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
We need to log that hashtag and track it.
That's true.
Can we work that into healthcare somehow? Yeah, well, I'm going to post the link to the first guide to ELO that was put out there by Mark Trapangan, and he put together a little description there. I've got an article in the list of articles that I put on the event page, but I did think that this how-to was really nice to look at if you are joined. I have not received an invite, so if any of you who are watching are already on, I would love to have an invite. How's that for just point-blank promotion there? Because I think it would be worth checking out. And I should probably mention my husband did receive an invite before me. He's going to love that I say that on air. So, well, I sent out an invite to join the Hangout. Sometimes we have people that are able to join us in the Hangout live for the last 15 minutes, but many times we don't, because a lot of our viewers are watching from their offices and they just take that half an hour, which we've already exceeded. So since nobody has popped in, since I have put that out on the event page, we're going to go ahead and wrap this up. We had a great discussion today, and I want to thank you both, Rick Wyan and Tom Lee, for joining me and for joining this conversation. I think we need to continue on with some of what we talked about later in the week and follow some of these trending topics. And Rick, I'm hoping that you and I will be able to get together in a separate hangout and really dive into some of the things that you just barely touched on today, because you are a wealth of information.
Thanks.
And before I close out, I would like to mention that Janine Bevan mentioned that I believe it was Jean, I'm looking for it here in the comments, that she said that FDA reopened the comment period, and it's open until October 29th. So this is actually not the deadline. So if anybody's been listening to this conversation and they have not given their own 2 cents to the FDA, there is still time. I don't know how easy it will be to actually follow this link, but I'm going to share it. There you go on the screen. So you can go to that website and give your 2 cents until October 29th. So this concludes this week's edition of What's News in Healthcare Social Media with me, Kathy Brown of Brand New Social Media, and my guest co-host, Rick Wyan and Tom Lee. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next week.